Hello and welcome to this episode of the AML Clinic podcast. I'm your host, Michelle Clement, former SRA AML Regulatory Manager, now working with firms to build defensible frameworks grounded in how the SRA assesses risk and decision making in practice. In this episode, we're taking a slightly different approach to AML. Rather than looking at policies, files, or enforcement outcomes, we're looking at something that often sits in the background, but tells you a great deal about how firms are really operating, and that's recruitment. Hiring decisions give a very clear signal. They show where firms are investing, they show where firms are under pressure, and how they're prioritizing risk in practice. They also reveal how seriously AML and compliance are embedded within the structure of a firm. To explore this, I am joined by Lauren Heger A, who has a unique vantage point across the market and sees these patterns play out in real time. Lauren is a principal consultant at QED Legal, specializing in legal compliance and company secretarial hiring. With over 5 years in recruitment, she began her career in the fintech space before focusing on legal compliance. She partners with law firms across the UK from high street to international, helping them build and scale their compliance teams. Lauren, you are welcome to the AML Clinic.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to chat through some recruitment today.
As am I. So I'd like to start with your perspective. From where you sit, what does that view across firms show you that the rest of us might not see?
Yeah, I think it's quite a unique perspective, and honestly, probably only something I thought about once we started talking. And I think one of the biggest things is I often see the reality of firms' compliance, growth, and hiring, often
Mm,
just not the PR that they want to put out. I think a lot of firms aren't actively, well, they don't actively advertise that they're hiring into compliance because there can sometimes be a little bit of a concern around how that's perceived externally, in terms of do they not have anybody in compliance? Are they uncompliant? So sometimes there's not that advertisement externally. And I think you see quite clearly through difference between like firms that talk about compliance quite
mm,
strategically, but also those who actually invest in compliance.
mm.
Some firms can talk the talk, and some don't actually invest in that compliance. So there is a real divide between firms that are building their teams proactively and those who only really hire when there's pressure, whether there's regulatory pressure, operational, or reputational, really.
That's really interesting. I think we will probably touch on those a bit further along. So, from that vantage point, what do the hiring patterns tell us about how seriously firms are actually taking AML and compliance? So, for example, are you seeing differences between firms that are more proactive, like you said? So, are there, more firms that are proactive or more firms that are reactive, would you say?
I'd say this year there's probably more firms that are proactive. If you'd asked me that question 12 to 18 months ago, it probably would have been a very different answer.
Interesting.
One of the key trends I think I probably have seen more at the moment is those SME level firms who seem to be taking compliance a little bit more seriously than they have
Mhm.
historically. I think typically those firms who maybe don't have a dedicated compliance resource, they've been relying on a senior partner, managing partner
Mm.
running the day to day. That seems to be one of the biggest increases this year in terms of the firms that are really investing in compliance. I think they're realizing that you need that presence and you need to take
Mm.
some of that pressure off your senior leadership as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's yeah. So those hiring patterns are, I think, give a quite a strong signal around priorities, and I wonder if it has anything to do with the FCA taking over, but who knows? Um, so when you look beneath that, where do you see misalignment? Because you mentioned some firms would, what they're advertising publicly or what they say publicly, but under the hood, it's not quite that. So, do you see any misalignment between where there are stated priorities and actual hiring decisions? So, where are the gaps?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think most of the time it tends to be in some of those kind of medium-sized firms where there will be this, I guess, advertisement, let's say, of, we have a really strong compliance function. We want to make sure that we're doing things in the right way. But often those are the firms that don't necessarily want to invest in compliance. And I guess I see that from you know, how much time are they freeing up to actually go through a recruitment process? How much are they paying these people? And that can come up quite a lot. And I think, some firms I work with tend to struggle a little bit in hiring people because they might have put a specific number on how much they think this person is worth. But in the market, if they're not worth that much and you need to pay
Hmm.
them more, you're never going to be able to hire them. So there's a struggle sometimes where those firms will delay and delay, and it can take them 6 to 12 months to find somebody. And then they realize at the end, oh, actually, we need to just pay them more money and we need to pay what that market rate is. And I think that's one of the key factors in, is this firm actually dedicated to compliance? Because if they're
Mm.
not, you can often see that early on in the process of where the blockers come in, I suppose.
Yeah, that is interesting. And then in relation to firms where maybe perhaps they only invest in compliance after something has gone wrong, or where they're under pressure, do you think as a recruiter, are you able to identify that that's the situation when you go to those firms?
Yes and no, I suppose. Some are upfront about it, some will tell me.
Yeah.
Some you don't tend to find out straight away. I often find with those situations, I tend to find out like 2 to 3 weeks later when the articles come out, and
Sure.
that's I think when I usually find out. But I find, yeah, kind of, it often comes from they've had that SRA inspection, and if they've come away with either a fine, I usually know about it because it's public information,
Yeah.
or they've had that very serious recommendation. If it is more of the serious recommendation, they're usually quite open with me about it. They tell me. I do find what's quite difficult about that reactive hiring, though, is, as I say, it's public knowledge most of the time. People
Yeah.
know what's gone wrong, they know why it's gone wrong, and it really makes it quite difficult to hire then if you've not been upfront about it. And if you're going,
Yes.
we're hiring because we want to future proof the business, we're hiring because we want to be proactive. And actually,
Mm.
2 weeks down the line, you find out that it's because of a fine or because of a
Hmm.
recommendation from the SRA. Most people in your process then have really big red flags, and they're
Yes.
thinking, well, now I don't want to work for a firm like this because I have this preconception that they're going to try and hide things already from me.
Mm.
So I think it really reflects on how you act as a firm, the way you hire your compliance people, because they will sniff that out.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really helpful in understanding where those gaps sit. Would you say there are other triggers that drive firms to hiring? So we've mentioned a bit about, where there are regulatory action or regulatory pressure. What other sort of patterns would you say you see?
Yeah, I do think regulatory is definitely a big part. Like, it's probably one of the biggest. You see it quite a lot in
Mm.
terms of, as we said, the FCA side of things is definitely a big part. Obviously, Australia's got a lot of it going on with their tranche two at the moment.
Yes.
I think the two other areas are probably like growth and internal pressure. Growth
Hmm.
is definitely a big driver. I would argue it's probably the lowest of all the drivers to hiring.
Okay.
Um, Not to say that firms don't do it, they do. I just think it usually is quite hard for firms to invest heavily in a compliance team before they've hired the fee earners that are making them money. I
Of
think
course.
it's quite like, as much as it's not something we want to admit, it is very simple. The business needs to be making more money to bring in more compliance people.
Yes.
Um, but that being said, like, I do see it happen more and more. Like, there's a really specific global firm that I work with quite heavily, and they have plans over the next, 2 to 3 years of really growing quite exponentially. And they're
Mm.
trying to proactively grow that team. So when they do grow and when they get to that size, they're already ready to deal with that capacity.
Sure.
Yes, firms are dealing with it, but if I'm honest, it is probably the lower banding more generally. I think internal pressure is probably one of the other bigger parts. Typically, it comes a lot from that pressure from partners and fee earners when your onboarding is just taking too long.
Yeah.
I spoke to someone the other day whose like onboarding process was kind of 7 to 10 days, and you get to that point, you start losing clients,
Yes. Of
and
course.
then your fee earners are frustrated because they're losing money, and then
Hmm.
your teams are overstretched. They're being asked to do more and more work. corners sometimes start getting cut, that increases your risk, and then it just creates
Yes.
loads of friction culturally. That tends to be one of the other bigger reasons alongside regulatory, is just because there is that internal pressure of people needing that resource and needing things to move a lot quicker and smoother to keep that,
Hmm.
I guess, client relationship very easy as well.
Yeah. So that's really interesting. So a couple of things that you said that stood out to me is the customer experience. So in terms of being able to provide the optimum experience for a client, that would be one reason. And the other um, would be structural differences. So whilst you were speaking and you spoke about the global firm that you work at regularly, I was thinking, well, actually, this would be a problem that larger firms would have as opposed to smaller firms. So that's quite interesting, that there's a pattern there as well. So on the flip side, what are candidates in the AML compliance space increasingly looking for? And what would you say that tells us about how the role is evolving?
I think there's probably two levels to look at here in terms of what people look for. And one is at the senior level, and one's probably the more junior level, because they want different things. The
Okay.
senior level, I think the bigger thing is that buy-in. Compliance people at that senior level want leadership to have that positive feeling about compliance. It goes back to what we were saying before in terms of having those problems with senior leadership and people wanting to cut corners and get things done. It's not what people want. I think a lot of those senior compliance leaders I talk to are just a little bit exhausted from having to constantly
Mm,
fight to get something over the line. I hear so many
yes.
people pointing out like legal flaws in policies and then hearing partners say it doesn't really matter. So I think especially that, COLP, MLRO, MLCO type role, they're putting their neck on the line and it really does
Yes.
matter to them. So,
Yes.
I think whether a senior leader holds a notional role or not, they don't often want to deal with a bad compliance culture, and they won't
Sure.
really let it slide.
Hmm.
So I think the credibility of the firm, credibility of the role is a really, really big thing for the senior level. On the more junior end, I think it's really quite a work-life balance. And I don't
Right.
want that to sound as they want to work less, because that's not what they're looking for. It's
Sure.
a lot of people I speak to are very passionate about compliance on a junior end. They want to build a career in
Mm,
that space. They've got really big ambitions. But when you have got those teams that are overstretched and they've got double the workload of most analysts across London, they're being asked to work later, they're having to deal with, a toxic culture. At the moment, people just won't stand for it. And I think because there are so many more firms growing their teams and focusing on a positive culture, they can go and get that elsewhere. They can go
mm,
and get the career progression. So they won't really stand for that pressure and that non-work life balance, I suppose.
mm. So generically, so the question that formulated as you were speaking was, I was just wondering, generically, back in the day, people used to get into jobs and would stay in the job for years. As a matter of fact, they'd probably stay in the job their entire lives. But obviously, that's not how it operates now. Would you say that's more so the case in the compliance sector, that people tend to hop around more than, well, I don't know if you'd know about other fields, but it's something that's like really prevalent in this field.
Yeah, I mean, definitely more so than if we were to have this conversation 5, 10 years ago. I think I see it a lot more from, if you look at the tenured people that I speak to in compliance, and they'll have often started their career in one place for 5, 6, 7 years, then gone somewhere else for another 5 years. But actually, more recently, they'll do 2 years one place, 3 years, 2 years, and you'll see they go and move a little bit more. I think it's hard because there's some preconceptions that come with that. But actually, I
Mm,
think it's just the nature of the compliance world at the moment. It is changing so much. There's a lot
yeah,
of firms who are arguably struggling with that change. And I think
right.
often if you've joined a firm that's struggling with that change or implementing a new system, it can be hard to stick around for that if that's not the type of
Mm,
person you are.
mm,
Um, and then it's also the firms that are growing exponentially. They'll pay you more money, they'll give you a better work-life balance. And there's just so much opportunity to take a step into those other roles now than there ever has been. I think previously you might have seen there's like one compliance manager at a good sized firm, and there's not many other firms in your region hiring into that role. So you kind of have to
mm,
stay there. So I think it is partly, there's a lot more option out there, really.
Yes, and especially with working from home now. So if your firm was asking you to come in 2 days a week, although I hear that some firms are in 3 days a week, but if you could commute, then I suppose that would be an option that you would absolutely consider.
Yeah, exactly. I see that a lot, especially people from outside of London when firms are looking at those 1 or 2 days a week in the office. They're happy to do that 2-hour commute into London for more money, better quality of work. So, yeah, it definitely has opened up a lot more.
Yeah, really interesting. Okay, so I always like to wrap up with something practical for firms to take away. So, taking all everything you said together, if a firm wanted to strengthen its AML compliance approach from a resourcing perspective, where would you say it should focus?
I think it's probably looking at the future. And I think, planning resources in line with your growth, but also in line with the projected regulatory changes as well.
Yeah,
And I suppose this does fall back to this whole what's coming up with the FCA changes, what's coming up with Tranche 2 in Australia, what are we expecting to come up soon? Because you do really need to think about these things ahead of time. You tend to see a lot of firms who maybe don't think about that until later on, and then they're scrapping around to try and find somebody, but
yeah,
most of the good people have already been hired
already gone.
because
Hmm.
so many people thought about it before. Um, so I think future planning is definitely a big thing, but I think also just engaging with the market and understanding what's going on. I think, speaking to recruiters, speaking to consultants and specialists, because they often know what's happening before anybody else.
Yeah.
Consultants have visibility on trends, recruiters have visibility on movement and potential risks and everything before it actually comes to the market. So I think
Mm,
having those conversations and just learning a little bit more is really helpful. I think, yeah, my long kind of overview is just compliance is very much a long-term investment, not a reactive hire, really.
yeah, I'd agree with you there. Thank you, Lauren. So I think that was very sound advice, and I found the discussion quite insightful. I think it's been really valuable to explore your perspective, particularly given your visibility across the market. Appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
You're welcome. So that's a wrap for today. If you found this episode useful, consider sharing it with your colleagues who live in the world of nuance risk and razor thin judgment calls. And if you've got a topic you would like me to cover, I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening to the AML Clinic. Until next time, stay informed and stay compliant.